My name is Ross Baadsgaard. I've been with Western Ag Credit for 36 years, and my current title is Senior Vice President of Credit Administration. I work in administrative matters and work mostly out of the Spanish Fork office. The topic we're going to discuss in this portion of our presentation of Borrower Basics has to do with setting realistic goals for growing your operation. And this is a very pertinent topic because most agricultural operations feel growth pressure, and that comes from several avenues. Probably the greatest pressure comes from the fact that costs tend to increase at a higher rate than commodity prices as time goes along. All you have to do is look back over time and think what you're paying for a jug of milk versus what cars cost now, for example, or what homes cost. And you can see that commodity prices have not increased nearly as much as other things, particularly with input costs that it takes to produce. Another factor that puts pressure on expansion has to do with that, the need to spread the high fixed costs of running a farming operation over more units in order to stay viable and efficient. Land and equipment costs, for example, fertilizer, and almost any input that goes into agriculture is very costly. And so the way you manage that is trying to become more efficient. And oftentimes that's done through size, spreading those costs over more units. Another one that we see quite commonly is when someone in the family wants to come back and join the operation, and in order to accommodate another living expense, the operation needs to expand and generate more revenue to support that additional family member. And also sometimes you find markets that require a certain volume of product, and those markets increase over time, and so sometimes expansion is required to adequately service your markets. And there are other reasons, but those are probably some of the primary drivers that cause pressure to expand. It's very common to see healthy, viable operations see the need to expand over time, and so they develop a methodical and planned approach, strategic you might say, to grow in order to remain viable and meet their long-range goals. And so what we're going to talk about here for a little while is a couple of ways you can go about growth, one way better than the other way. And the preferred way to grow your operation is through careful planning. As part of that careful planning, you first established a foundation for growth by taking your existing operation and getting it better, getting it operating at an optimal level before you springboard to getting bigger. Getting better before getting bigger. And basing your expectations of growth on a realistic expectation of generating a positive return on your investment. That's a foreign concept in many cases when people look at expanding their operation. But I had a wise man once tell me that if it's not going to make me money, I don't need to own it. And I think that's a good philosophy when you're looking at growing. If that investment you're looking at making isn't going to make you money, then why do you want to own it? Another wise man said, if it's not going to make me money, I'd rather go fishing. And I think those are two good philosophies. Another thing than carefully planned growth is you don't cut things so close that you don't maintain enough allowance for adversity. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And it's also in response to staying competitive with your peers and in your markets, and as we mentioned earlier, to serve your markets as your markets grow. Poorly planned growth also has some characteristics. If it's not planned, then often it can lead to financial distress during times of adversity because you haven't planned to hold back those reserves that will get you through the tough times. Oftentimes, what works at one level in regards to management doesn't translate to a larger, more complex operation, and so there can be unexpected management challenges. It becomes more about managing people, for example, than just dealing with animals and crops. And oftentimes, growth that's poorly planned doesn't take a realistic view of the assumptions in regards to costs and income. We often see that those projections are too optimistic in terms of income and underestimating costs. And here's a big one that we often see is that if an operation isn't doing very well, isn't thriving, they think the solution to that problem is to grow out of it. And oftentimes that doesn't work. If the main motivating factor to growing is to solve a problem, then it probably isn't going to work. And so you can look at these two approaches. I like to categorize them as one is an emotional approach to expanding, and the other one is a logical approach. Emotional reasons for expansion might include things such as, we hear this a lot, they're not making any more of it in regards to real estate, so I need to buy while it's still available and before prices get even higher. Or it might be, this used to be Grandpa's farm and I want to get it back in the family. Or it could be something like, if I don't buy now, I may never get another chance. Now in saying this, we all realize that when that farm next door comes up for sale, it may only come up once in a generation. It may only change hands very infrequently. But that shouldn't be, if that's the primary reason for buying it, then that is an emotional driver. Or here's one that we've seen a lot the last few years, is there's a new normal with high commodity prices, and so we won't experience commodity price lows like we've seen in the past. There's a new normal. And all of these things, since 2014, we found out that that new normal didn't exist, and we're seeing commodity prices now that have gone to low points that we really didn't expect just recently. And here again, getting bigger will solve my problems. That's a red flag if that's the reason you're wanting to expand. So those are just some of the emotional drivers for expansion, and those may get you into trouble if those are your main motivators. The pitfalls to emotional motivators are you tend to jump in at the top of the business cycle when there's a lot of excitement. It's interesting to note over our years of working in agricultural lending that there's a lot of excitement when commodity prices are high. That's when we get a lot of loan requests of people wanting to jump in or expand. And so income projections are based on the continuation of those high markets. We forget that Newton's law of gravity, what goes up must come down. And we tend to minimize the costs and management demands that are associated with expanding. And we often make our decisions and our projections based on short-term rather than long-term considerations. And we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go along here. A logical approach to expansion goes back to this expectation of a reasonable rate of return based on, and here I want you to key on this, on long-term conditions, not where we might happen to be in the market the day you decide to expand. Taking out those peaks in those cycles. A careful analysis shows that the efficiency gained will offset the cost of expanding. It will improve your break even. And that's critical. And that you will maintain enough reserves after the expansion. You won't deplete your reserves. You'll maintain enough to get through difficult times. There have been and always will be up and down cycles in agriculture. It's just the nature of things. And it's part of a long-term strategic business plan. It's part of forward planning. And it's allowed you to put your resources in place in preparation for this next step. Not something that you're just jumping at over a momentary opportunity. This graph just shows, it's just to illustrate the ups and downs of a commodity cycle. And sometimes it's not in an even cycle like that, but that'll illustrate the fact that there's ups and there's downs. And most growth interest occurs at the cycle peaks, like I mentioned a few minutes ago. That's when everybody gets excited. And you need to move before prices get even higher. Or you expect high commodity prices to continue. Those $3 calves that we saw a couple of years ago, they're always going to be there. Incidentally, those that bought cows based on $3 calves, they're probably struggling a little bit right now with the $1.50 calves. There's lots of buying and selling activity. There's buyers and sellers out there ready to do deals. And so there's a lot of opportunities. And as a lender, we typically see the most interest in new loans at the peak of the cycle. We'd just like to make this point. If you have no better than the industry long-term break even, in other words, if your costs are pretty typical with everybody else industry-wide, then that tends to put you at a line in the middle of that cycle, and over time your gains will be largely offset by your losses, and thus limiting your financial progress. You'll have years you lose money, you'll have years you make money, but over time you'll just kind of tread water. But you want your break even to be below the long-term average so that you're competitive with your peers. And this next graph kind of illustrates that. That line at the top kind of shows where the industry break-even might be. You want your break-even to be somewhere below the industry. You want to be more competitive than your peers. That means you're going to have staying power. You're going to last longer and be able to survive the troughs in those cycles. Now, the reason I bring this up is when you make an expansion decision, well, this just shows where that line that's towards the top of those peaks, it just nips off the tops of those peaks. That's where most people make their growing decisions to expand or to grow. And that just doesn't leave you a lot of room for adversity when you start hitting those troughs, because there's a lot of troughs underneath those peaks. I've got just a very basic financial example to show the considerations that need to be thought through when you're making an expansion decision. This is just a hypothetical financial statement from that would illustrate just a simple non-complex operation, and just making some basic using some basic numbers just to make some points. At the top line, you'll see some operating expenses and some debt and a debt service figure. And then the balance sheet broken into those typical sections of liquid assets and current debts and fixed assets and long-term debts. And just a couple of things I want to point out from this example. One is that is the working capital, which is that basic accounting formula of current assets minus current liabilities. And your working capital is what you have to pay bills with. And you want that working capital to be positive. That means you have enough money to pay your bills. The other one I want to point out is the net worth, and that shows how much of your assets you own relative to what your debtors own. And in this case, you'll notice that there's $40,000 of working capital, and your equity ownership would be 60%. In other words, of the $792,000 of assets, you own 60%, your creditors own 40%. So that's where you're at before you decide whether or not to expand. That $40,000 of working capital relative to your operating expenses and your debt service would get you by for 7 months. And it's unlikely that there would be an event that would wipe out that much working capital in 1 year. So if you had a crop failure, if you had a disease problem, if you had a weather event that hurts your operation, you could probably get through a year with a minimal disruption to your operation with the amount of working capital that you've got. Secondly, with a 60% equity position, you have a little borrowing capacity if you need to get through an unexpected problem. So you have a plan B and you have a plan C. Plan D is the one we all try to avoid, which is default on your debts and the requirement that you'd have to liquidate your collateral in order to satisfy your obligations. Plan A, of course, is that you make enough income off the farm to pay your expenses and your debt service. Plan B is you fall back on your working capital reserves. Plan C is that you still have some borrowing equity. And Plan D, of course, is when things fall apart and you have to liquidate, perhaps even get out of business. Here's the proposition that you're considering. Your neighbor has 50 acres that's come up for sale. It's $5,000 an acre, $250,000. So here's what you think about. You hate to see someone else buy the property and be a bad neighbor. We hear that quite a bit. It probably won't be available again for another generation. We hear that a lot too, and these are probably both true statements. It'll provide a little extra room to run more cows. And someday it may grow houses, making it a good investment for your children or grandchildren. So here's what the financial statement would look like if you were to buy that property. A couple of things I want to point out. There was $20,000 cash on the previous statement. You've used that cash towards a down payment on the property. Your debt's gone up by the remaining $230,000. Your land value's gone up by the $250,000 that you bought. And so the bottom line is your working capital went from $40,000 to $15,000. That's because of the cash you used towards a down payment and also the current portion of that debt that you're going to owe on that, on the amount you borrowed. Your debt's gone up because of the portion that you financed, but your net worth didn't change. You acquired another asset, but you used up some of your assets and debt to buy that asset, so it all equalized out, so your net worth has stayed the same. What's changed is you have less working capital, and your equity went from 60% of your portion to 46%. So what are the ramifications of that? Your working capital, instead of covering 7 months, it now will cover not quite 2 months. An event that could wipe out that much working capital is a common occurrence in agriculture, and it could cause some disruption in your operations. Secondly, your equity position went from 60% to 46%, meaning your creditors own a little bit more of your business than you do, and that leaves little additional borrowing capacity in the event that you encounter some unexpected problems. So there's not much of a firewall to protect you against Plan D. It's not going to take too much of a hiccup of things not going right to put you in a difficult spot. So with using sound planning, I think hopefully this illustrates the importance of maintaining ample working capital. Don't leverage yourself to the limit. Always keep some cards you can play another day if needed, and have options you can fall back on short of selling assets or getting out of business. And by the way, that little financial example, when you're considering something like this, you always have a loan officer you can go talk to that can help you through that. They can take your current financial information and they can show you what it would look like if you were to do what you're proposing to do. They can help you through that exercise specific to your operation. And also sound planning, and this is something we really want to emphasize, is use projections supported by long-term history, not just what today's prices might be, and that will even out those ups and downs in the cycle, and it will give you a better idea of if this proposal will sustain itself over the long term and through those various points in the commodity cycle. Now just to sum things up here, Western Ag Credit has a credit philosophy that I think aligns with what's in your best interest and also what's in our best interest as a sole agricultural lender. We understand the need and risk associated with expansion, and most of our successful borrowers over the years have expanded and been successful at it. We view our role as being a partner in making a sound business decision that has a high probability of success and adequate risk protection for both you and us as a lender. We're committed to financing eligible operations, and here's a key term that I think is for all of us to think about, and that is that the transaction be considered constructive. A constructive loan or proposal will provide an actual benefit to your operation and your lifestyle without creating undue risk. Constructive lending is something we take seriously. We do not consider it constructive to finance to the extent that the first problem results in financial distress. We understand the cycles in agriculture and strive to provide financing that will withstand the ups and downs. And when we both understand where we are going and we're in agreement, we can become successful long-term partners. Thank you for joining this session of our Borrowing Basics course, And hopefully this information will be helpful. And please feel free to contact one of our loan officers to discuss these and any other questions or matters that you may have. And thank you.